Quote, "We know what happened to those who chanced to meet the great god Pan, and those who are wise know that all symbols are symbols of something, not of nothing. It was indeed an exquisite symbol, beneath which men long ago veiled their knowledge of the most awful, most secret forces which lie at the heart of all things. Forces before which the souls of men must wither and die and blacken, as their bodies blacken under the electric current. Such forces cannot be named, cannot be spoken, cannot be imagined, except under a veil and a symbol to the most of us appearing a quaint poetic fancy, to some a foolish tale. But you and I, at all events, have known something of the terror that may dwell in the secret place of life, manifested under human flesh, that which is without form, taking to itself a form." End quote. That is from Arthur Machen's masterpiece in weird fiction, The Great God Pan, published in 1894. This passage invokes the mythological, obviously. We know what happened to those who chanced to meet the great god Pan. Pan is the Greek god of rustic places, of the woods and wilds, who was said to appear as a satyr or a faun, and who was associated with the playing of pipes, and was appeased by the offerings of shepherds and hunters, and from whose name we get the word panic. If one beheld the great god Pan, it is said that they were struck by a panic terror, meaning a terror of panic origin. So originally panic is an adjective. We've just dropped the last word, terror, and now use panic as a noun. It was by the time of the Romans that Pan came to be regarded as a god of all. Pan was already a god of nature, but there are many gods of nature, and it isn't clear that Pan was regarded as nature's great god until the time of the Romans, who drew a connection between their word Pan, meaning all, and the god Pan. And it is famously in that strange story from antiquity around the time of Jesus that we have the first record of the full phrase, the great god Pan, but it appears in the report of Pan's death. We discussed this in the episode on Carl Jung's psychoanalysis of Nietzsche. But there was a story from that time in antiquity that a ship passing by a mysterious island overheard a ceremony of some wild revelers of the nature gods. And at the climax of this ceremony, all voices shouted, "The great god Pan is dead." Obviously, this is just a strange rumor, a fable, but this story came to be regarded, especially by the Victorian era, as a kind of synchronous, spontaneous declaration of the victory of Christianity over paganism. And by this time in the 1800s, there was a renewed interest in classical antiquity, and a fascination with paganism came along with that. And so there were those in England who would invoke this story in that line, "The great god Pan is dead," as a way to remind their fellow intellectuals that a move toward paganism was a step backward. Because England at this time, just as today, was very much enamored with the notion of progress, and many had come to see history as consisting of a series of improvements in some way. And the conventional viewpoint in Britain would have associated that social progress, intellectual progress, moral progress in England with their religion, with Christianity. And yet, especially during the early 1800s, many of the intelligentsia and the young romantic writers of the time became increasingly involved with paganism and even came to identify as neo-pagans, including, to greater and lesser degrees, people like Byron, the Shelleys, Thomas Love Peacock, Matthew Arnold, and so on. Arguably, much of the appeal of paganism to them largely had to do with Romanticism, with the reaction against industrialization, urbanization, financialization, and so on, and a consequent nostalgic look backward to an idyllic earlier time, and sort of a wistfulness towards the countryside, towards the rural or agrarian lifestyle, and yes, to the religious beliefs of people from the apparently simple and idyllic time period of ancient Greece. The way that this movement at the beginning of the 1800s eventually has an influence on the creation of the genre we call weird fiction today can be seen in the example of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, who was one of these romantic writers. Frankenstein's monster has become just one of a slew of horror monsters who, seems to reappear seasonally, as though Frankenstein's monster is a sort of eternal form. But it's worthwhile to remember the cultural context in which the Frankenstein story is written. Who is Dr. Frankenstein? He is, as the subtitle of the story tells us, a modern-day Prometheus. So there's a reference to pagan myth in Frankenstein that Shelley is intentionally invoking. Frankenstein steals the fire from the gods. Not literally fire, but we might say the fire of life, the spark of creation. But how does he do it? He does it through scientific understanding of the physiology, by use of electrical currents. Dr. Frankenstein's means of stealing the fire from the gods is by acquiring knowledge of these invisible, unseen forces that exist behind reality. These electrical fields, the inner workings of cells, the bonds between molecules. And Dr. Frankenstein, in the course of the story, from doing this, has a horrible fate befall him. His own creation terrorizes him. He finds that playing at being a god and bringing a new consciousness into the world, a being that has free will and can therefore suffer and have desires that might diverge from what Dr. Frankenstein originally imagined, that might not be a good idea to create a being like that unless you actually are God. And so this points to one of the running threads throughout much of the weird fiction genre that Mary Shelley helps to inspire, which comes right out of that romantic reaction to the classical age. The fear that science may indeed open up new vistas of knowledge, but that those vistas might be horrifying. It might indeed provide us with new powers, but there could be disastrous consequences of wielding those powers. Weird fiction has been called a cross between the horror genre and the genre of magical realism. Magical realism we would normally associate with authors such as Borges, that found its heyday in Latin America. Weird fiction, on the other hand, is a decidedly Anglo-American genre, and it comes into its own in those last decades of the 1800s and the first decades of the 1900s. The writing of Shelley and other neo-pagan romantics was influential on its development, as were the works of Edgar Allan Poe, Lord Dunsany, and others. If we were to situate this literary movement within a given time and place, therefore, we would have to say it's reflective of that undercurrent of fear and uncertainty that emerged at the end of the long 19th century in the English-speaking world. This uncertainty comes at the end of the 19th century, or the end of the long 19th, because, as Nietzsche says, the development of knowledge has made the mood of the era more honest, but also gloomier. This is sort of, I would say, the result of the great humiliations of mankind. The knowledge that we're not the center of the universe, that man is merely one of many species of animals, that the earth has been around for billions of years and the human race has only walked its surface for maybe a few 100,000. And so accordingly, in Machen's horrifying world, as he says in that paragraph we just opened with, it's ruled by forces, quote, the most awful, most secret forces which lie at the heart of all things, end quote. Now, Arthur Machen, the author of The Great God Pan, is not a materialist. He was for a time an occultist, and he seemed to hold the belief throughout his whole life that the phenomenal world as it appeared was a mere mask for a chaotic spiritual reality that's beyond our understanding. But nevertheless, the story begins with the monologuing of a character named Dr. Raymond, who more or less espouses that same belief of the real-life Arthur Machen, the author, that the phenomenal world masks a hidden reality. Dr. Raymond wants to pull away that veil, but he wants to do it, like Dr. Frankenstein, by means of science. Dr. Raymond doesn't presume to be able to glimpse the true world with a mystical vision, but by making surgical alterations to a patient's brain, tinkering with their physiology in some strange operation that's potentially a hybrid of maybe occult knowledge and fringe science. But the result is that they'll be able to see past the phenomenal world and glimpse those forces behind it. And so in some way the goal is the same as Dr. Faustus. I want to know what secret force moves behind the world and directs its course. But, of course, Dr. Faust sticks purely to reading occult manuals and old texts on witchcraft and transacting with the devil and summoning spiritual entities. whereas in the new mold that we see in Dr. Frankenstein, and in the case of this story, Dr. Raymond, we get the sense that they are able to penetrate the veil due to the science and technology that's now available to them. That this is through the scientific and empirical inquiry, through the gathering of new knowledge, now they have reached the point of being able to do this. That this isn't perhaps something that would have been available to people with strictly ancient or occult knowledge. So that element of the horror of science, that would, of course, become very, influential on H.P. Lovecraft. That is very much there in this story. So even though Machen is not a materialist, he's not a mechanist, this isn't a reason for him not to fear the course of scientific inquiry, if I could put it like that. Rather, there's a fear constantly in the background of the story, the fear of the truth being uncovered. There are characters in this story who know, or at least have some inkling of the horrifying truth, but they almost always stop just short of speaking of it, or speaking of the whole of what they know, or they suggest burning evidence at various points, or finding some way to hide the truth from all the world. As one of the characters, Clark, says, quote, "There must be some explanation, some way out of the terror. Why, man, if such a case were possible, our Earth would be a nightmare." End quote. So it's not as if Machen presents a world in which rationality and empiricism and inquiry are ineffective. The problem is that they are effective. The structure of the great god Pan is what appears to be on a first read almost a series of non sequiturs, perhaps loosely related incidents. Characters telling stories to one another of things that mostly happen to other people. Characters speaking of rumors, giving one another second-hand information. In fact, the last chapter of the great god Pan is simply a series of fragments, journal entries, notes. And so even though we do sort of nominally follow one of the main characters who has a detective streak, it's almost like we are the detective who's poring over all of this information, these secondhand stories, these notes and fragments, trying to piece together what has really happened. And that's what happens over the course of the story, is that the characters take this unconstellated knowledge, these strange occurrences that might seem at a glance to be unrelated, and they begin to arrange it into an intelligible story. But as the characters begin to draw their conclusions, they continuously wish to turn back. They're like Jocasta, begging each other, like Jocasta begging Oedipus, not to go on seeking the truth. And so it is a steady revelation of horror, a detective story that doesn't lead to a comforting certainty that now we know what happened, but instead leads to an ever more heightened terror, an ever more heightened uncertainty about the nature of reality itself. The character Villiers expresses this in the paragraph we read at the very beginning. The symbol of Pan, like all the other past religious symbols, is but a veil. It's a way to cover over the awful truth. The religious, the mythological, is a kind of facsimile. It's an attempt to render a placeholder image for that which, as Machen says at the end of the passage, is without form. And I would also like to recall here the Bacchae by Euripides, the way that Dionysus appears in that play in many guises, as a man, as a bull, as a phantasm, as an unseen force that shakes the earth, as a lightning bolt, as a revealed god at the end of the play. Which one was the real Dionysus, quote unquote? Well, Dionysus represents the dissolution of the self and the destruction of the image. He represents iconoclasm. And in his drunken revelries, his rituals, he changes our ordinary sensations, our ordinary perceptions of the world. He annihilates the ordinary and replaces it with an altered perception. And so he's accordingly a god of illusions. And like all gods, he can only appear to mortals in a given form, but his true form, quote unquote, would not only be beyond our comprehension and beyond our ability to withstand, it also stands to wonder whether, by the very fact that he is the god of illusions, whether he's more fully revealed in a false form. And so we can only ever approach the god by image. Similarly, in Donna Tartt's Secret History, the Bacchanalia scene, this revelation of Dionysus, the characters say they met Dionysus, but it's only experienced secondhand. And in some sense, it has to be that way, Because no narrative, no set of images, no set of perceptions are truly an experience with the god, with the noumenon. Did the bacchantes, the characters who have this hallucinatory alteration of reality, did they perceive the world as it is or the world as it is not? Did they encounter the quote-unquote true Dionysus, or are you only ever encountering a given form of Dionysus? Similarly, in the great god Pan, this is why most of the information that comes to us as readers is second or third hand, in the form of recollections and stories and rumors. Almost nothing that happens in the scenes as we read them, in the present moment of the scenes, almost nothing happens in the present moment. It's almost all characters recounting things. So reading the great god Pan, again, it's like poring over witness testimony. We're like a detective trying to chase down a cold case, because all the information comes to us by these degrees of removal, which then always raises the question of unreliability, intentional or otherwise, the increasing distortion as the signal passes through multiple receivers. But I think this is to the advantage of the story for the same reason that we can't portray Dionysus in his true divine form in the Bacchae. The god Pan and his human incarnation in the story, the god Pan looms over the whole thing, but never directly appears. He's there throughout the whole story, and yet we never see him, because it seems that everyone who sees the great god Pan goes mad. So Machen can never directly show it to us. We're like looking at the Medusa's head through the mirror of the shield, right? Perseus's shield. Now, before we get deeply into the story, we'll take a quick look at the life of Arthur Machen, whose real name was Arthur Llewellyn Jones. Machen was his pen name. He was born in 1863 in Wales at Caerleon. During his childhood, he would visit the Roman ruins at Caerwent, and in fact, throughout the region there are these old Roman roads and evidence of Roman habitation from thousands of years beforehand, and at least partially this inspired some of the content of the great god Pan, the sense of wonderment and awe and even unease that the young man had while exploring these ruins. Eventually, the young Arthur Llewellyn Jones went to London for a higher education. He sat for the exams to get into medical school, but he didn't make the cut. He earned whatever he could from various jobs, such as clerking or journalism, while writing in his spare time. In truth, his life wasn't terribly difficult at this time because he had a passive income from a type of inheritance that helped to support him. In 1881, his first publication was a long-form poem about the Eleusinian Mysteries. He managed to get published in a number of literary magazines, and he found a home of sorts in the publications devoted to Gothic horror and fantasy. He adopted the pen name Machen and managed to get semi-regular work. Like many great artists, however, Arthur Machen spent years in obscurity, and though he wrote most of the works for which he is now renowned during these decades of the 1880s and 1890s, he was largely unsuccessful and unknown during this time. Then Machen's life took a strange turn. His wife died of cancer at the end of the century in 1899, and this absolutely devastated him. He abandoned writing entirely and became an actor. He joined a traveling company of players who put on productions all around England, and he eventually met his second wife through this new profession. But he would not write again until 1906. It was also during these years that Machen became involved with occultism. This may seem like a relatively fringe movement these days, something that everyone kind of has a laugh at, but occultism at the turn of the 20th century was very popular, very trendy phenomenon. Although I should clarify that Machen was actually skeptical of many of the trends that were in occultism at this time because they were just rife with hucksters. And this is actually referenced in the story in the character of Clark, who tries to disabuse himself of supernatural beliefs by going to, attend seances and see spirit mediums and so on because they're so obviously fake. It's so obviously a hoax. But nevertheless, there were still many people with esoteric or neo-pagan beliefs within high society at this time. And Machen became acquainted with Arthur Edward Waite. And if you've ever picked up a deck of tarot cards, a standard deck of tarot cards, the most common deck of tarot cards that you'll find, you'll see the names Waite, Rider. Arthur Edward Waite, who went by A.E. Waite, is one of those names. He was an occultist himself, and he was a historian of the occult. He was a Freemason. He was also a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And Arthur Machen briefly joined the Golden Dawn, but he wasn't terribly involved. In fact, he eventually became part of the Anglican Church, and late in his life he converted to Roman Catholicism. By around 1910, the funds that had sustained him were more or less depleted, and Machen could no longer afford to earn a living as an actor. He finally accepted a full-time job as a journalist. And it should be noted that journalism really used to be considered, relatively speaking, a working-class occupation. I mean, maybe it's the job for the brainy person of the working class, but nevertheless, being a journalist was not the prestige position in society that it is today. Machen worked at the newspaper through World War I. He was let go in the early 1920s, but that decade also saw a renewed interest in Machen's fiction. And suddenly the works that he'd written 20 or 30 years before, like Three Impostors and Hill of Dreams and The Great God Pan, these enjoyed a boom in popularity, and there were reprintings of these books that were financially lucrative for Machen. But by the end of the 1920s, that revival was over, and Machen once again struggled to make ends meet, and that would go on for the rest of his life. But there was a heartwarming development in 1943. On his 80th birthday, a literary appeal was launched, and contributions were given by the likes of T.S. Eliot, Bernard Shaw, Walter de la Mare, and Algernon Blackwood, among others, in order to sustain Machen financially for the rest of his life. And if you just think about what else was going on at that date, in 1943 in England, it's remarkable that they were able to pull together the financial resources to support him during that time. It shows how much the literary community had come to recognize Machen's contribution and to love and respect Machen, because it's an incredible gesture that at least ensured he was taken care of for his final years. Arthur Machen died at 84 years old in 1947. Stephen King called The Great God Pan the greatest horror story in the English literature, and it's now considered a classic. But during its own time, the story was denounced as an example of decadent, scandalous literature. Now, as to why this backlash occurred, I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that the story is pro-Pan in any way. He's presented as a horrifying figure, more or less on par with the devil. At least that's how the characters in the novel seem to experience Pan. But in the same way that there's no truly anti-war film, a story like this one, a story about debauchery, about decent men losing their morals and committing suicide, even if that's presented as an evil, it still enthralls us precisely because it's titillating to explore such evils. Ostensibly, we're rooting for the hero in the horror film, right? But in a voyeuristic way, we enjoy seeing the protagonists get torn apart. And this is the suspicion, I think, behind the criticism that the novel faced when it first came out. The condemnation that was leveled at both the story and Machen himself. That writing a story about the devil and the devil's exploits is a debauched thing to do, even if the story presents the devil as a villain and a calamity. And so in that way, Machen's contemporaries, I think, revealed themselves to be very similar to the protagonists in Machen's story, who think it would be better to cover over any trace of the devil's existence rather than write a story like this one. And so it does leave us to wonder whether there was some element of critique of the public consciousness at the time, because in the same way that people reacted to Jonathan Swift in a way that was quite commensurate with Jonathan Swift's critique of intellectualism, petty intellectualism, here Machen's critics reacted to him very much like the frightened and hesitant main characters that appear in The Great God Pan, who discover the truth but then believe this truth can never be made known. Because, at least presumably, every Victorian English Christian ought to believe in the existence of the devil, right? And so this story could easily be taken, I could imagine a response to it in which it's taken as a fair warning to young men to not get involved with loose women, right? And that is sort of what the feminist critique of this story suggests that it actually is, although I personally don't agree with that interpretation. So it could have been taken that way, but it wasn't. And so that might point to something that Machen was trying to tell us about the state of society. We don't want to look at the evil in our current culture, in the current zeitgeist. But this ought to leave us to wonder, I suppose, in interpreting the work, what the meaning of Pan taking on such a villainous aspect in the story really means when we consider Arthur Machen himself. I mean, Machen clearly had a kind of awe, a kind of love for the pagan world of pre-Christian Britain. And, he's an occultist and all of these things. So he later wrote of the great god Pan that he had been a clumsy translator of the feelings that he had felt in his youth while standing in those ancient ruins, in those enchanting woods. He writes, quote, "I translated awe, at worst awfulness, into evil. Again, I say, one dreams with fire and works in clay." End quote. Especially given Machen's lifelong conviction that there was something beyond the material, it seems hard to square the circle of making the nature god of the Greeks and Romans that stands behind reality into a figure so manifestly evil. And one of the ideas both wonderful and terrifying behind this work is that prospect that the gods of pagandom were real. A mask for something, sure, a symbol, certainly, a truth veiled over, but a truth nonetheless. So does Machen really believe that any glimpse behind the veil would necessarily reveal something terrifying? It's a very bleak view of reality for a man who believes in a spiritual world. And I don't think Machen held that view in reality. And furthermore, as he later converted to Christianity, there was clearly something in him that believed in a benevolent possibility for the divine as well as a menacing version of the divine. So it's just interesting that in later years, in retrospect, he didn't harden in his conviction that Pan is like the devil. Like this is all the more reason to run headlong into the salvation of Christianity. Instead, he thinks, I was a bit too clumsy in presenting the unknown, the chaotic force behind nature, as if it were pure evil. But I think there is a charitable read of the story that allows us to square this circle, even admitting the shortcomings that Machen seems to see here in conveying his artistic vision. And that would be that everything we're getting in the story is for the most part secondhand, as we've said. We're often getting commentary on the narrative from characters who are scandalized and horrified by the events involved. And it hardly bears arguing, but the fact that something destroys or threatens or harms you doesn't mean that it hates you and that it's evil. The characters might interpret the great god Pan as evil. But one of the running threads of weird fiction is the monstrous, terrible reality, it's actually indifferent to you. That's the real horror. And that would become a common aspect in Lovecraft's writing. Nyarlathotep doesn't hate you. Cthulhu doesn't hate you. He doesn't care about you at all. He's indifferent to your existence because you're a lesser life form, like the way we would regard an ant or a rabbit or a mouse. What do we do with such animals? We treat them as pests, exterminate them because they're annoying, or we run experiments on them, or we hunt them for sport or even for pleasure. Or in the best cases, we might take them as a pet, but we simply don't value their lives. That would be the gist of this. The amount of value we place on the life of a mouse is probably similar to how the great old ones think about a human life. So they're not like the devil, who has a real interest in the sins of mankind and therefore has a real interest in the lives of human beings. The devil's invested in mankind, and that makes mankind a thing of significance to the devil, even if the devil hates us and opposes us. And so there's a real question as to whether the great god Pan is more like the devil or whether he's more like Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep. Obviously, the characters in the story believe he's like the devil, but they would think that, wouldn't they, from the current cultural framework, the cultural software, the religious software that they're running in their heads? They would see Pan and they would say, that's the devil. And if we remember what Nietzsche writes about what happens every time the Dionysian came crashing like a tidal wave into an unsuspecting culture, it brings chaos and upheaval and threatens to disrupt and overwhelm everything. And that's what's also dramatized in the Bacchae. Dionysus destroys Pentheus. He destroys the entire house of Cadmus. He torments an entire city. And yet he's still a divinity that's ultimately worshipped as one of the two gods that have blessed mankind. Demeter, who grows the grain, and Dionysus, who gave us the gift of wine. And that's particularly important, not just because of the many benefits of wine, but because wine is the way of communing with the gods, pouring libations out to the gods. And when you pour a libation of wine as an offering to the gods, you're pouring Dionysus himself. So he is the intercessor, the bridge. He's the communion between man and God through wine. And so those are like positive and negative aspects to Dionysus, who again is not exactly equivalent to Pan. But there are ways in which a divinity could be destructive to human life. This is even portrayed in the Old Testament of the Bible, and not be doing it out of malice. So again, we come back to the question, is Pan actually like Satan, or is he like Dionysus in Machen's story? And again, from the Christian perspective, Pan, Dionysus, Bacchus, these have always been associated with Satan. The Victorian Christians celebrated that old anecdote, the great Pan is dead. With the death of Pan comes Christianity, and there's these horned entities that look very much like demons from the Christian perspective. Or you could argue that the entire image of what a demon is really inspired by the image of gods like Pan. And pagandom was demon worship from the Christian perspective, theologically. So naturally, the characters in the story treat the encounter with the god Pan as an encounter with the devil. And several lives are destroyed in the story, just as Dionysus destroys lives in the Bacchae. But we never see the god Pan. We never hear Helen speak in the story, speak for herself. So we don't know if there's actually some underlying logic or justice to it in the mind of Pan, some reason behind what's going on, or perhaps in the mind of his human incarnation that we perceive in the story. And that element of mystery, I think, actually works, again, for the story. The fact that we're always a degree of removal away, there's always a degree of unreliability, and a degree to which the narrator, the person who's telling us the story, is infusing their own prejudices and their own values and beliefs. So let's now talk about the story. It begins with Clark, who has been called to the country house of Dr. Raymond to be witness to an experiment. Raymond has practiced what he calls transcendental medicine for 20 years, and he's come to believe that by a certain surgical operation, he could alter a patient's brain such that they would be able to see past the phenomenal world. Clark is worried about whether the experiment is truly safe, and Raymond says there's no physical danger at all. Any surgeon could perform this operation. The only reason why Dr. Raymond is the only one who's ever done it is because he's noticed a detail in the brain, a certain cluster of cells, and has developed an understanding of their relation to the brain that the majority of all the other neuroscientists has missed. And as to what they're trying to achieve in this experiment, Raymond tells us in the opening passages, quote, "Look about you, Clark. You see the mountain and hill following after hill as wave on wave. You see the woods and orchard, the fields of ripe corn, and the meadows reaching to the reed beds by the river. You see me standing here beside you and hear my voice. But I tell you that all these things, yes, from that star that has just shone out in the sky to the solid ground beneath our feet, I say that all these are but dreams and shadows, the shadows that hide the real world from our eyes. There is a real world, but it is beyond this glamour and this vision, beyond these chases and aras, dreams and a career, beyond them all as beyond a veil. I do not know whether any human being has ever lifted that veil, but I do know, Clark, that you and I shall see it lifted this very night from before another's eyes. You may think this all strange nonsense. It may be strange, but it is true, and the ancients knew what lifting the veil means. They called it seeing the god Pan." Clark shivered. The white mist gathering over the river was chilly. End quote. What I love about this passage in the opening is the paradox of it, because as Raymond is telling us how the phenomenal world is not real and is a mere veil to hide the truth, his description of the phenomenal world around them is so evocative. It's so vibrant that as he describes it, we can see it, we can place ourselves in the setting, and immediately when he's done speaking, Clark shivers. He reacts to the external environment, the phenomenal world around him. And so this is the strange dance that goes on throughout the Great God Pan, where much of the story is about the terror lurking behind the ordinary world. But the ordinary world, the phenomenal world, is described in such evocative, vibrant, beautiful terms, dare I say. Now, the subject of this experiment is to be Mary, a young woman whom Raymond has apparently adopted and raised, but has no compunction about using as part of what we'll later come to understand is a very dangerous experiment, which throws serious doubt on Raymond's morality as a character. Quote, "As you know, I rescued Mary from the gutter and from almost certain starvation when she was a child. I think her life is mine, to use as I see fit." End quote. Clark does not argue with him about this. Clark is simply in awe about the things that Raymond has told him and the possibilities that he's expounded upon. This strange world that they may glimpse, albeit indirectly. Raymond says that he can manipulate Mary's nerve centers. Quote, "With a touch, I can bring them into play. With a touch, I say, I can set free the current. With a touch, I can complete the communication between this world of sense and..." We shall be able to finish the sentence later on. Yes, the knife is necessary, but think what the knife will effect. It will level utterly the solid wall of sense, and probably for the first time since man was made, a spirit will gaze on a spirit world. Clark, Mary will see the god Pan. End quote. The last part of Raymond's preparation for the experiment seems to have perhaps an alchemical element to it. Clark doesn't really understand the specifics of what Dr. Raymond is doing. He just watches as he lights a flame under a crucible and begins mixing chemicals. And even though the smell is noxious, Dr. Raymond tells him it's not harmful and you don't need to worry about it. But a strange thing happens as the smell begins to fill Clark's nostrils. A sort of strange lethargy washes over him, and he finds himself lost in memories from his childhood. Memories of a long walk he'd taken 15 years ago, the last time he saw the woods and fields that he'd played in as a child. It's almost as if the alchemical preparations that Raymond makes, the noxious fumes that Clark breathes in, that later he gives some of the vial of this substance to Mary. It somehow, in this process, induces this dream of longing for the forests of Clark's childhood awe. So we can see even in this first part of the story, which ends in a horrifying way, there's an undertone of a kind of awe and mystery in regard to the natural world, the wilds, the world of Pan. Dr. Raymond goes to fetch Mary, and they begin the operation. He sedates her, and he begins cutting into her scalp, and Clark looks away. The whole operation takes only a couple of minutes, and soon Raymond is binding up her wound, and he says that she'll awake in 5 minutes' time. But when she finally does awake, quote, "Suddenly, as they watched, they heard a long-drawn sigh, and suddenly did the color that had vanished return to the girl's cheeks, and suddenly her eyes opened. Clark quailed before them. They shone with an awful light, looking far away, and a great wonder fell upon her face, and her hands stretched out as if to touch what was invisible, but in an instant the wonder faded, and gave place to the most awful terror. The muscles of her face were hideously convulsed. She shook from head to foot. The soul seemed struggling and shuddering within the house of flesh. It was a horrible sight, and Clark rushed forward as she fell shrieking to the floor. 3 days later, Raymond took Clark to Mary's bedside. She was lying wide awake, rolling her head from side to side, and grinning vacantly. "Yes," said the doctor, still quite cool. "It is a great pity. She is a hopeless idiot. However, it could not be helped, and after all, she has seen the great god Pan." End quote. That's the end of the first chapter, and the story then picks up years later, around probably 2 decades later, in the city of London. The first character that we follow after this time jump in chapter 2 is Clark, but that might lead you to believe that Clark is the main character, and he isn't, really. In fact, there isn't really a main character in the traditional sense, but if there is one, it's Villiers, who doesn't appear until chapter 3. Clark exemplifies the inherent tension that exists at the heart of all horror fiction, and particularly weird fiction, and that we want to know but we don't want to know. Or to speak more precisely, Clark secretly has a morbid fascination with the supernatural in private. He wishes to understand it and document it, but he simultaneously fears it, and he doesn't want it to be publicly known that this is an interest of his. It's something he hides from the rest of the world. And his reason for this is that the truths that he thinks he's discovered would raise the prospect that we live in a rather nightmarish world. And so on the one hand, we naturally hunger to know the naked truth, but Clark is a man who's glimpsed perhaps the very edges of that truth by being a witness to the experiment, and therefore he has a fear for the truth. So this is the way Machen describes him. Quote, "A person in whose character caution and curiosity were oddly mingled. In his sober moments he thought of the unusual and eccentric with undisguised aversion, and yet deep in his heart there was a wide-eyed inquisitiveness with respect to all the more recondite and esoteric elements in the nature of men. The latter tendency had prevailed when he accepted Raymond's invitation, for though his considered judgment had always repudiated the doctor's theories as the wildest nonsense, he secretly hugged a belief in fantasy, and would have rejoiced to see that belief confirmed. The horrors that he witnessed in the dreary laboratory were to a certain extent salutary. He was conscious of being involved in an affair not altogether reputable, and for many years afterwards he clung bravely to the commonplace and rejected all occasions of occult investigation. Indeed, on some homeopathic principle, he for some time attended the seances of distinguished mediums, hoping that the clumsy tricks of these gentlemen would make him altogether disgusted with mysticism of every kind. But the remedy, though caustic, was not efficacious. Clark knew that he still pined for the unseen, and little by little the old passion began to reassert itself as the face of Mary, shuddering and convulsed with an unknown terror, faded slowly from his memory." End quote. It's revealed then that Clark has steadily assembled a book, a document that he calls, quote, "Memoirs to Prove the Existence of the Devil," end quote. And Machen writes that Clark has this fascination for the occult, for ghost stories, and for the supernatural, but he loses all the interest that he might have had in these stories as soon as they're popularized, as soon as they're published in magazines. And he has a preference to collect stories in his own voluminous little text that he keeps only for himself, which he pores over in secret at night in the privacy of his London home. And in chapter 2, he goes and he flips to the story that disturbs him the most of all these fables and rumors that he has collected. It's the story of a young girl named Helen. Helen was sent by her adopted father to live in a Welsh village under the care of a farmer who was given the pseudonym in this retelling of Mr. R. The girl had a strange appearance. Quote, "Her skin was a pale, clear olive, and her features were strongly marked and of a somewhat foreign character." End quote. Her father sent a generous stipend to Mr. R, and accordingly everyone believed that the girl came from a good rich family. Her adoptive father communicates with Mr. R by means of letters, stating that his intention is for the girl to be around children her own age and grow up in a good, wholesome environment. And he says that Helen must be given free rein to indulge her favorite hobby, running off into the woods for hours at a time. Quote, "Mr. R states that he has known Helen to go out by herself directly after their early breakfast and not return till after dusk, and that, feeling uneasy at a young girl being out alone for so many hours, he communicated with her adopted father, who replied in a brief note that Helen must do as she chose." End quote. Sometimes Helen would take other children along with her on these long rambles in the forest. And because the other parents believed that Helen's father must be rich and connected, they weren't bothered so much by their children associating with such a strange and eccentric young lady. But eventually there were a number of unexplained and disturbing incidents with the other children. First, a younger boy of 7 years old who goes looking for flowers in the woods reports stumbling upon Helen playing with a strange naked man. The boy was evidently horrified by this man's appearance, but was unable to really describe him any further. And while the father of the boy was furious at Helen, she denied any knowledge of what the boy was talking about, and everyone chalked it up to maybe a dream or fantasy the child had had. And yet, the boy continued to suffer anxiety attacks, waking in the middle of the night, wailing about the man in the woods. Over a long period, he slowly recovered, but later, when they took, the boy and his father were visiting the house of another family, he was suddenly struck by an inexplicable panic terror from which he never fully recovered. Clark's memoirs say that he's intellectually hindered to this very day. As for what frightened him, one of the villagers had recently dug up an artifact from among the ancient ruins that was the image of a faun or satyr and displayed it in their home. The second such incident concerned a girl named Rachel M., daughter of Mrs. M. Helen grew older, and even though she was always a strange-looking girl, her features softened, and she came to become close friends with Rachel. Often Rachel would accompany Helen on her long walks along the old Roman road, rambling through the forests, and Rachel's parents began to realize that their daughter's personality was changing, but they still allowed her to associate with Helen up until the point when they very much regretted that fact. Quote, "Once or twice after these excursions, Mrs. M. thought her daughter's manner rather peculiar. She seemed languid and dreamy, and it has been expressed, different from herself. But these peculiarities seem to have been thought too trifling for remark. One evening, however, after Rachel had come home, her mother heard a noise which sounded like suppressed weeping in the girl's room, and on going in found her lying, half undressed, upon the bed, evidently in the greatest distress. As soon as she saw her mother, she exclaimed, 'Mother, mother, why did you let me go to the forest with Helen?' Mrs. M. was astonished at so strange a question and proceeded to make inquiries. Rachel told her a wild story. She said, Clark closed the book with a snap and turned his chair toward the fire. When his friend sat one evening in that very chair and told his story, Clark had interrupted him at a point a little subsequent to this, had cut short his words in a paroxysm of horror. 'My God,' he had exclaimed, think what you are saying. It is too incredible, too monstrous. Such things can never be in this quiet world, where men and women live and die, and struggle, and conquer, or maybe fail, and fall down under sorrow, and grieve, and suffer strange fortunes for many a year. But not this, Phillips, not such things as this. There must be some explanation, some way out of the terror. Why, man, if such a case were possible, our earth would be a nightmare.' But Phillips had told his story to the end, concluding, 'Her flight remains a mystery to this day. She vanished in broad sunlight. They saw her walking in a meadow, and a few moments later she was not there.' End quote. So we don't really know the conclusion of Rachel's story here, the horrible thing which causes this paroxysm of fear. We can very well guess, but even the fact that it's left to the imagination helps to play upon the fear of the unknown that's central to this story. And by the way, we should remember, Clark is receiving this information already third hand. He's getting it from a friend named Phillips, but Phillips presumably was not present for the events. These are stories Phillips heard from the villagers. Machen even includes little footnotes in the memoirs to prove the existence of the devil that presumably Clark has made in the text, such as when he notates about the head of the satyr, that Phillips saw this relic personally, and he said it was the most vivid image of evil he'd ever seen. But since he has to notate that Phillips has seen it, that implies that Clark hasn't seen the image. And so in lieu of a real description of the image, we get the feeling that was experienced by Clark's friend when he saw it, that he felt it was a vivid image of evil. So that isn't an objective description of the object. It's a feeling. And that's what I mean with that undercurrent of unreliability in the story that adds to the mystery. The fact that we're always 1 or 2 or 3 degrees removed from the actual events and we're trying to trace a narrative through it to somehow constellate these facts and reach an understanding of their reality. But all we have are stories and rumors. And the chapter ends, quote, "Clark had tried his best to disbelieve it all. But at the end of the account, as he had written it in his book, he had placed the inscription, Et diabolus incarnatus est, et homo factus est." End quote. That is an evil reversal of the Nicene Creed. The phrase means, and the devil was incarnated, and he became a man, instead of the actual Nicene Creed, which would be, God was made incarnate through the Virgin Mary and became a man. It's not clear from the details of the story so far why Clark would write this. Was the man in the woods the devil become flesh? Well, we'll discover this as the story goes on. But in the next chapter, we leave Clark and we begin to follow his friend, Villiers. What brings Villiers into this story is another seemingly unrelated incident. After dinner, Villiers runs into an old school friend named Charles Herbert. Villiers is part of high society. And Herbert came from the same set. He was a man of good family, a man of wealth and means. But when Villiers runs into Herbert, after having not seen him for many years, it's because Herbert is asking him if he has any change to spare. He's begging for alms. He's now a person living on the streets. And Villiers says, "My God, Herbert, I hardly recognized you. Why don't you take my arm, come up to my room and have a meal, and I have to find out what happened to you, why you're in this state." Quote, "The ill-assorted pair moved slowly up Rupert Street, the one in dirty, evil-looking rags, and the other attired in the regulation uniform of a man about town, trim, glossy, and eminently well-to-do." End quote. So these two men began in the same social position, but they've landed in entirely different places in life, and naturally Villiers asks, what happened? And it's revealed Herbert sold all his properties. He squandered all his wealth. He lost all of his possessions. And as to how, he said he made the mistake of falling in with a woman named Helen. He married her and lived a fast and hedonistic lifestyle. Quote, "My friends had come to know her at Florence. She told them she was an orphan, the child of an English father and an Italian mother, and she charmed them as she charmed me. The first time I saw her was at an evening party. I was standing by the door talking to a friend when suddenly above the hum and babble of conversation I heard a voice which seemed to thrill to my heart. She was singing an Italian song. I was introduced to her that evening, and in 3 months I married Helen. Villiers, that woman, if I can call her woman, corrupted my soul. The night of the wedding I found myself sitting in her bedroom in the hotel, listening to her talk. She was sitting up in bed, and I listened to her as she spoke in her beautiful voice, spoke of things which even now I would not dare whisper in the blackest night, though I stood in the midst of a wilderness. You, Villiers, you may think you know life, and London, and what goes on day and night in this dreadful city. For all I can say, you may have heard the talk of the vilest, but I tell you, you can have no conception of what I know. Not in your most fantastic, hideous dreams can you have imaged forth the faintest shadow of what I have heard and seen. Yes, seen. I have seen the incredible, such horrors that even I myself sometimes stop in the middle of the street and ask whether it is possible for a man to behold such things and live. In a year, Villiers, I was a ruined man in body and soul. In body and soul." End quote. So once again, I brought up this point in prefacing the story, but we never have a scene where Helen speaks, which would be actually quite interesting because we learn that she can charm everyone. She sings in this beautiful Italian song, and then on their wedding night, what he describes that was so terrifying that happened on that night are not things that she did, but things that she spoke about. Things that he said I would not dare whisper in the blackest night. And so all of this sort of plays upon our imagination further of what kind of woman Helen is. But we never see her directly in a scene, right? It's all recollections of her. But Villiers obviously wants more information as to what Herbert really means by this. He isn't really clear on the details of how they get from A to B. Like, how is it that marrying Helen led directly to his ruin? Yes, he sold everything, and then he says that she took all of the money, took everything from him. But how did he end up in that position in the first place? Why did he put himself in that position? And I wonder how many people have ruined themselves financially and then blame someone else for leading them astray or corrupting them. So, it's still a bit confusing, but when Villiers presses him, Herbert won't say any more. Quote, "The rest of my story is of no interest. Sordid misery, that is all. You may think, Villiers, that I have exaggerated and talked for effect, but I have not told you half. I could tell you certain things which would convince you, but you would never know a happy day again. You would pass the rest of your life, as I pass mine, a haunted man, a man who has seen hell." End quote. So, there's something more than a fast and reckless lifestyle that's responsible for Herbert's ruin. This can't be read as just a morality tale, right? I mean, that there might be that undertone here, but we get the sense this man has perhaps participated in some debauched activities, that somehow Helen seduced him to immorality in some way. And later in the chapter, as Villiers tries to follow up on the story, he learns that Charles and Helen Herbert were connected to a mysterious death. A man died of unexplained causes on their property. He was found dead right next to their house. A man who was otherwise responsible, respectable, and apparently mentally stable. The police and doctors couldn't determine exactly how he died, and they had no motive, no reason for his slaying, and the Herberts denied all knowledge of the man's death at the time. So we're left to wonder, supposing that Charles Herbert was, say, in a marriage with a devilish being, who knows what he got up to, right? We aren't told. It's left up to the imagination. And to what extent was he consenting at these points? He's putting it as, she corrupted me, but clearly you were attracted to her and you went along with whatever it was that she was doing. There was a real seduction there. So, in any case, Villiers takes note, Herbert eats but little. He mostly seems pensive and uncomfortable, and he's happy to leave when Villiers gives him a small gift of money. And Villiers asks him what Helen's full name was before Herbert leaves, and he says that she went by Helen Vaughn, but he doesn't think that was her real name. Quote, "What her real name was, I can't say. I don't think she had a name. No, not in that sense. Only human beings have names, Villiers. I can't say any more." End quote. And we learn a bit later in the story that shortly after his encounter with Villiers, Charles Herbert passed away by seemingly voluntarily just not eating and starving to death. Villiers, in a following scene, goes to speak to his friend Austin, and he asks him if he knew Charles Herbert. Austin immediately recalls the incident in which a man of high society was found dead near the Herberts' house, and he recounts how the neighbors had many rumors about what went on in the house of Charles and Helen Herbert. They spoke about these rumors in sort of hushed tones. Quote, "The detectives tried to trace down these rumors to some solid foundations of fact, but could not get a hold of anything. People shook their heads and raised their eyebrows and thought the Herberts rather queer, would rather not be seen going into their house, and so on, but there was nothing tangible. The authorities were morally certain the man met his death in some way or another in the house and was thrown out by the kitchen door. But they couldn't prove it, and the absence of any indications of violence or poisoning left them helpless." An odd case, wasn't it? But curiously enough, there's something more that I haven't told you. I happen to know one of the doctors who was consulted as to the cause of death, and sometime after the inquest I met him and I asked him about it. "Do you really mean to tell me," I said, "that you were baffled by the case, that you don't actually know what the man died of?" "Pardon me," he replied. "I know perfectly well what caused death. He died of fright, of sheer awful terror. I never saw features so hideously contorted in the entire course of my practice, and I have seen the faces of a whole host of dead." The doctor was usually a cool customer enough, and a certain vehemence in his manner struck me, but I couldn't get anything more out of him. I suppose the Treasury didn't see their way to prosecuting the Herberts for frightening a man to death. At any rate, nothing was done, and the case dropped out of men's minds. End quote. Villiers takes it upon himself to track down Helen Vaughn, or rather Helen Herbert, but discovers that she seemingly has vanished. The house has remained deserted since the Herberts left it, and Villiers visits it under the pretext of renting it. Villiers says that he mostly enjoys touring old, empty houses, but he felt none of that whimsy while exploring this one. All he felt was a mounting sense of dread, until he reached the room he says was the worst. A largish room that should have been pleasant enough, but caused him to feel nothing but horror. In that room he makes a discovery. Quote, "In one corner there was a pile of newspapers littered on the floor, and I began looking at them. They were papers of 3 or 4 years ago, some of them half torn, some crumpled as if they had been used for packing. I turned the whole pile over, and amongst them I found a curious drawing. I will show it to you presently, but I couldn't stay in the room. I felt it was overpowering me. I was thankful to come out, safe and sound, into the open air. People stared at me as I walked along the street, and one man said I was drunk. I was staggering about from one side of the pavement to the other, and it was as much as I could do to take the key back to the agent and get home. I was in bed for a week, suffering from what my doctor called nervous shock and exhaustion." End quote. Villiers then goes to see his friend Clark. And Villiers goes to Clark because he thinks he is a practical sort of person, a common sense sort of person. And the irony here is that, as we know, Clark actually has some special insight as to who this woman is, but as Machen tells us, Villiers is unaware, as everyone else is, of Clark's memoirs to prove the existence of the devil. What we normally expect at this point in the story is the two men would pool resources and begin to put 2 and 2 together, so to speak. But what Machen tells us of Clark's inner thoughts during this meeting is that he's intent on not letting on about his beliefs in the supernatural. First, Villiers tells Clark what he has learned of Herbert's life and how the man's story and his very appearance chilled him to the bone for reasons he can't explain. But Clark responds, quote, "Isn't this all just a little fanciful, Villiers? I suppose the poor fellow had made an imprudent marriage and, in plain English, gone to the bad." End quote. So Villiers tells Clark of the murder on the Herbert's property, or at least the unexplained death, the strange house and the strange feelings he had there. And Clark dismisses this as well. He voices the opinions that one would, expect from a commonplace, practical sort of person, but that we would not necessarily expect from a man who keeps a secret book documenting the evidence for the existence of the devil. And so he reacts this way, all for the sake of maintaining this deception of being an ordinary practical man with ordinary practical interests. Quote, "And that is the story, is it?" said Clark musingly. "Yes, that is the story." "Well, really, Villiers, I scarcely know what to say about it. There are no doubt circumstances in the case which seem peculiar. The finding of the dead man in the area of the Herbert's house, for instance, and the extraordinary opinion of the physician as to the cause of death. But after all, it is conceivable that the facts may be explained in a straightforward manner. As to your own sensations when you went to see the house, I would suggest that they were due to a vivid imagination. You must have been brooding in a semi-conscious way over what you had heard. I don't exactly see what more can be said or done in the matter. You evidently think there is a mystery of some kind, but Herbert is dead. Where then do you propose to look?" "I propose to look for the woman whom he married. She is the mystery." The two men sat silent by the fireside, Clark secretly congratulating himself on having successfully kept up the character of advocate of the commonplace, and Villiers wrapped in his gloomy fancies. "I think I will have a cigarette," he said at last, and put his hand in his pocket to feel for the cigarette case. "Ah," he said, starting slightly, "I forgot I had something to show you. You remember my saying that I had found a rather curious sketch among the pile of old newspapers at the house in Paul Street. Here it is." End quote. What Villiers shows him is a drawing depicting Helen, which is marked with her name, and Clark practically turns white. He completely fumbles the act he's been successfully putting on up to this point. Villiers immediately recognizes that Clark knows something, and that Clark is horrified by the image, by the depiction of Helen. There's a dead silence of several minutes, Machen writes, and Clark lets the paper simply drop from his hands. Villiers practically begs Clark to help him, but Clark says, I might be able to help you or I might not. I'll have to think it over. And he plays off his reaction as a momentary lightheadedness, which Villiers knows that it isn't. So again, this is a theme in this story, that Clark has to some extent uncovered some sort of evidence, or what he believes to be evidence of the supernatural. In fact, that's his main hobby in life. But he's opposed to sharing this information. He shies away from the opportunity to share it because, for one, he fears what they will discover by constellating the knowledge. And for a second thing, we get the sense that he fears the social consequences of revealing this knowledge, what it will reveal about him. Another character that is similar to this that we've already seen is Herbert himself, who says, I've seen hell. I'm a haunted man. I'm not going to tell you anymore, or you would have no more happiness for the rest of your days. So those who have glimpsed the great god Pan, glimpsed the terrible truth behind the world of appearance, in this story, when they're asked to talk about what they saw, they almost always say no. If I shared it with you, I'd be hurting you. And the next time Villiers goes to see his friend Austen, who asks him, did Clark help you in untangling this mystery of Mrs. Herbert? He says no, and I received this letter from Clark, quote, My dear Villiers, I have thought over the matter on which you consulted me the other night, and my advice to you is this. Throw the portrait into the fire. Blot out the story from your mind. Never give it another thought, Villiers, or you will be sorry. You will think, no doubt, that I am in possession of some secret information, and to a certain extent that is the case. But I only know a little. I am like a traveler who has peered over an abyss and drawn back in terror. What I know is strange enough and horrible enough, but beyond my knowledge there are depths and horrors more frightful still, more incredible than any tale told of winter nights about the fire. I have resolved, and nothing shall shake that resolve, to explore no whit farther, and if you value your happiness, you will make the same determination. Come and see me, by all means, but we will talk on more cheerful topics than this. End quote. So this man who his preoccupation is with assembling evidence of supernatural evils in his spare time rejects the opportunity to pursue this further. And it's exactly the same sentiment expressed by Herbert. If you value your happiness, you will turn back now. And so this continually happens in the story. The investigator begins to pick up a narrative thread, but we get to the moment, right up to the precipice of looking into the void, and the thread disappears. And then all we can do is speculate. As for why Clark is so spooked by the picture, we have an indication in this scene as to why, a bit of foreshadowing. That personally, I think, actually gives away the twist at the end. The foreshadowing is too good. I think it's perfectly fine to give away the twist, because, in all honesty, if you're really astute, you might have even already figured it out. If you're versed in weird fiction and horror stories. But the image of Helen, who would seem to be the same young woman who was years before the little girl in the Welsh village, surrounded by strange rumors, why would Clark be so horrified by this image of the adult woman, Helen? Because presumably he never saw the little girl, Helen. He just heard stories about her through the Welsh villagers, through Philip, who told them to him. And yet, the image of Helen reminds Clark of something from his past. So this is going back to the scene where Clark first beholds the image of Helen. Quote, he was looking intently at the small pen and ink sketch of the woman's head. It had evidently been drawn with great care and by a true artist, for the woman's soul looked out of the eyes, and the lips were parted with a strange smile. Clark gazed still at the face. It brought to his memory one summer evening, long ago. He saw again the long, lovely valley, the river winding between the hills, the meadows and the cornfields, the dull red sun, and the cold white mist rising from the water. He heard a voice speaking to him across the waves of many years, and saying, Clark, Mary will see the god Pan. And then he was standing in the grim room beside the doctor, listening to the heavy ticking of the clock, waiting and watching the figure lying in the green chair beneath the lamplight. Mary rose up, and he looked into her eyes, and his heart grew cold within him. Who is this woman? He said at last. His voice was dry and hoarse. "That is the woman who Herbert married." Clark looked again at the sketch. It was not Mary after all. There certainly was Mary's face, but there was something else, something he had not seen on Mary's features when the white-clad girl entered the laboratory with the doctor, nor at her terrible awakening, nor when she lay grinning on the bed. Whatever it was, the glance that came from those eyes, the smile on the full lips, or the expression of the whole face, Clark shuddered before it at his inmost soul and thought unconsciously of Dr. Phillips' words, "the most vivid presentment of evil I have ever seen." End quote. So Helen resembles Mary, but she doesn't look exactly like Mary. There's something else. She has Mary's features, but it looks as though perhaps she is maybe the result of Mary mingled with the features of someone else or something else. Something in her expression and her terrible eyes reminds him of what Dr. Phillips said was the most vivid presentment of evil I've ever seen. What does that refer to? The icon of the satyr's head, which the child in the village associated with the naked man in the woods that he'd seen playing with Helen. So obviously the deduction that one could easily make from here is that Helen is in some way the offspring of both Mary and the great god Pan. And so did Clark already put this together? Is that why he wrote, "The devil has been incarnated and become a flesh and blood man"? Maybe rather than the meaning that the devil has become a man as in a male, he means the devil became human. That Helen is the child begotten by Pan, and the way Yahweh begets Jesus, a darkened version of the biblical incarnation. And, the other obvious correspondence here would be Mary's namesake, the Virgin Mary. It's just that instead of the union occurring because of divine will or something like that, it occurs through brain surgery, right? We don't get the sense that Pan came and inseminated Mary. It was through adjusting her physiology to perceive a world beyond the senses, through a scientific violation or disruption to the natural order. Is that what created Helen? And the details about Helen's Eastern features, meanwhile, sort of reminds of the descriptions of Dionysus in ancient stories, that these satyr deities, these nature deities, these deities that are associated with piping and drumming and these ecstatic mysteries, like Dionysus and Pan and Cybele. Dionysus has an Eastern appearance in human form because he's an Eastern god. He comes from Lydia. He comes from Phrygia. He was initiated into the rites of Eastern mother goddesses. And then also we could think of the name Helen. She's in some way like a daughter that comes out of the Hellenic world that's born into the modern age. In the following chapter, Villiers is no closer to locating Mrs. Herbert. But the case remains on his mind as he and Austen take a walk together through London, and they find themselves on Ashley Street, where they stop and admire the house of a Mrs. Beaumont. Villiers doesn't know anything about her, so he asks, "Oh, what do you know about this Mrs. Beaumont?" And Austen says she's a wealthy new socialite in London, apparently from South America, though Austen isn't sure from where exactly. Quote, "I hear she has some wonderful claret, really marvelous wine, which must have cost a fabulous sum. Lord Argentine was telling me about it. He was there last Sunday evening. He assures me he has never tasted such a wine, and Argentine, as you know, is an expert. By the way, that reminds me, she must be an oddish sort of woman, this Mrs. Beaumont." Argentine asked her how old the wine was, and what do you think she said? "About 1,000 years, I believe." Lord Argentine thought she was chaffing him, But when he laughed, she said she was speaking quite seriously and offered to show him the jar. Of course, he couldn't say anything more after that, but it seems rather antiquated for a beverage, doesn't it? End quote. So it would seem, at least at a glance, that in this chapter we've dropped the last thread again, and we've encountered another non sequitur here. But I think for most modern readers, you can probably figure out, in fact, this is not a non sequitur. We already know it's very likely that Helen Vaughn goes by many names, as Villiers has begun to suspect. They even uncover a third identity for Helen in the later chapters of this book. So I guess I'm jumping around a bit here, but I think most of you will have figured out more or less immediately that Helen is right here under Villiers' nose in this scene. This Mrs. Beaumont, this strange, oddish sort of woman who's mingling with high society. Why is she mentioned? Us modern readers, we're used to looking for the twists. We're used to looking for the tropes, the hints, the foreshadowing. So I think it's a rather obvious twist. But when the pair reaches Austen's house, their topic of discussion shifts to a friend of Austen's named Myrick. Myrick was a painter, and he was a frequent conversation partner with Austen, and he left for New York a year and a half previously with the plan of traveling the Americas. And he ended up in a hospital in Buenos Aires, and apparently passed away recently. And in accordance with Myrick's wishes, the attending physician mailed a book in his possession to Austen. And Austen, ever since receiving it, has kept it in a chest, locked away. He takes it out and he shows it to Villiers, and inside are disturbing phrases written in Latin and profane sketches and drawings, and a picture that is unmistakably the likeness of Helen. And the two immediately realize she's struck again, right? But the two realize that Myrick must have somehow encountered Helen in South America, and given that Mrs. Beaumont is apparently from South America, that's also not a difficult deduction to make from there. After this, there's like a long scene where Villiers basically tracks down Helen's activities and follows her and ultimately confirms that Mrs. Beaumont is Helen Vaughn. And I'm mostly just going to gloss over that. What's interesting to me about this scene is the way Myrick's tome of crazy ramblings and drawings is described, and particularly Villiers' response to Austen about how to deal with the manuscript. Quote, Villiers turned page after page, absorbed, in spite of himself, in the frightful Walpurgis night of evil, strange, monstrous evil that the dead artist had set forth in hard black and white. The figures of fauns and satyrs and aegipans danced before his eyes. The darkness of the thicket, the dance on the mountaintop, the scenes by lonely shores, in green vineyards, by rocks and desert places passed before him, a world before which the human soul seemed to shrink back and shudder. End quote. Further down toward the end of this chapter, Villiers tells Austen, quote, Lock the book up again, Austen. If I were you, I would burn it. It must be a terrible companion, even though it be in a chest. End quote. So even Villiers, who's become the de facto lead detective when it comes to this case, right, who asked Herbert to tell him what happened and was denied, who asked Clark for his help and was denied, who seems to have taken it upon himself to untangle this mystery, even to put a stop to these killings, even he advises his friend Austen, yeah, this piece of evidence, you should lock this up or burn it. So even Villiers is not very different from Clark, who said to burn the portrait, right? He's not very different from Herbert, at least insofar as he doesn't really want to spread the knowledge of these dark forces to the world. He doesn't want to spread it to others. And for the same reasons as were stated by those other characters, it's think of your happiness. Even keeping this debauched tome locked away in a chest is a terrible companion. In other words, it's sure to upset your mental state in some way. The final chapters concern a string of suicides, including the aforementioned Lord Argentine, along with 3 other men, who all kill themselves by means of suffocation, by strangling themselves with rope, by hanging themselves. All of these men are said to be of sound mind, and more than that, to be largely happy men, in love with life, men who lived charmed, wealthy lives. And the common thread in all of these suicides is that they were recent friends of Mrs. Beaumont. And as yet another suicide is reported in the newspaper, Austen reads it aloud to Villiers with horror, declaring that he means to leave London. It's a city of nightmares. The most recent victim of this epidemic of suicides, unexplained thus far by Scotland Yard, was a man named Crashaw. And Villiers tells Austen, well, as a matter of fact, I saw Crashaw in the early hours of the morning, just before he died. Where was he? Austen asks, and Villiers tells him, I saw him coming out of the house that you told me was Mrs. Beaumont's house. Austen is perturbed by this, but he asks Villiers to elaborate, and he does. Quote, I was at a house near Regent's Park last night, and when I came away the fancy took me to walk home instead of taking a hansom. It was a clear, pleasant night enough, and after a few minutes I had the streets pretty much to myself. It's a curious thing, Austin, to be alone in London at night, the gas lamps stretching away in perspective, and the dead silence, and then perhaps the rush and clatter of a hansom on the stones, and the fire starting up under the horses' hooves. I walked along pretty briskly, for I was feeling a little tired of being out in the night, and as the clocks were striking 2, I turned down Ashley Street, which you know is on my way. It was quieter than ever there, and the lamps were fewer. Altogether, it looked as dark and gloomy as a forest in winter. I had done about half the length of the street when I heard a door closed very softly, and naturally I looked up to see who was abroad like myself at such an hour. As it happens, there is a street lamp close to the house in question, and I saw a man standing on the step. He had just shut the door, and his face was towards me, and I recognized Crashaw directly. I never knew him to speak to, but I had often seen him, and I am positive that I was not mistaken in my man. I looked into his face for a moment, and then, I will confess the truth, I set off at a good run, and kept it up till I was within my own door. Why? Why? Because it made my blood run cold to see that man's face. I could never have supposed that such an infernal medley of passions could have glared out of any human eyes. I almost fainted as I looked. I knew I had looked into the eyes of a lost soul, Austin. The man's outward form remained, but all hell was within it. Furious lust and hate that was like fire, and the loss of all hope, and horror that seemed to shriek aloud to the night, though his teeth were shut, and the utter blackness of despair. I am sure that he did not see me. He saw nothing that you or I can see. But what he saw, I hope we never shall. I do not know when he died. I suppose in an hour or perhaps 2. But when I passed down Ashley Street and heard the closing door, that man no longer belonged to this world. It was a devil's face I looked upon." End quote. And so we might think back to Chapter 3 of Mr. Herbert telling Villiers how Helen corrupted him in body and soul. And we get a description here which is all things which Villiers sort of sensed or extrapolated solely from looking at Crashaw's face. But nevertheless, it's a description of what being corrupted in body and soul looks like, what is really meant by that. You're emptied out of who you used to be, and it's all replaced with lust and hate and despair. But again, this isn't really a concrete description. It's Villiers recalling a facial expression of a man he saw but didn't speak to. So we don't have the objective description. We don't have the experience of seeing the man. We can only listen secondhand to the story of the encounter with him. And as I mentioned before, Helen also appears in no scenes like in the present. Like we're not in any scenes with Helen. All of her appearances are through other characters. And it's mostly characters who have been affected by Helen who are in the scene. But again, she never speaks a single word in the story. And the only place in the story where I'd really be interested in what she might have to say would be the climax, the confrontation between Helen and Villiers. And we never even see that scene in the novel. We hear about it after the fact, or we hear about the aftermath of it. Even though Villiers has been the main character for most of the story, or the closest thing to it, the character we follow most closely in the present moment of the story, when it comes to that scene, that's where it's recounted in the fragmentary notes that comprise the final chapter. But to go back to Villiers recounting the seeing Crashaw, right? I love the concept that the passions shone forth out of the eyes, out of his gaze. It's such an unholy roil of passions within the man that it seems inhuman, as if who Crashaw was has already been replaced by some other kind of consciousness. The way that Dante talked about, if somebody was sufficiently evil enough, they don't even have to wait to die to go to hell. They just get taken down to hell immediately, and a demon replaces them and walks around in their body for a time. So my reading of this, the implications of the story are that Crashaw really did kill himself, at least insofar as he dies by his own hand, right? Not that Helen killed these men and made it look like suicide, but they were driven to suicide in some way, that she quote-unquote corrupted them. But how would that be, yet again? Are they merely innocent victims, or did she get them to somehow indulge in some form of debauchery? Did they morally stain themselves due to their association with her? Did they do things that are perhaps devilish? Did they do things that would make a man lose his soul, so to speak? And viewing it from the outside in, we just see, oh, look at the corrupting influence of this woman. Villiers finally decides that this is going to stop. And once he figures out that Mrs. Beaumont is Helen, Villiers resolves to Austen he's going to put an end to this. He says he and Clark are going to go and confront Helen. He's purchased a length of cord, material with which one could strangle a human being. And, Austen's horrified. He's like, you're not going to kill her. And he says, no, but I'm going to lock her in a room with it, with the ultimatum that she has 15 minutes to either end her life or I will call the police. So he plans to capture her and give her a choice of whether to be incarcerated or to take her own life. It stands to wonder, incarcerated for what, though? Exactly what he's threatening her with. Because do the police have proof of anything? If these men killed themselves, is she really responsible for that? And if she is a supernatural entity, how do you capture her? And what would Helen have to say to someone giving her such like a moral ultimatum? End your life to end the evil things you're doing, or I shall turn you into the authorities. What does Pan incarnate in the form of Helen Vaughn say to that? And we never see any of those scenes. And it's the one area where I don't like the mystery of it. I think writing that scene would be a great opportunity. But again, we don't get the scene. But Austen begs Villiers not to do this. And Villiers seems to have a lot of confidence about this plan. For what reason, I'm not sure. But the chapter ends abruptly shortly after he describes what his plan is. And so the chapter ends, we don't get the initial scene, the confrontation, but the final chapter is the fragments. And we learn through these at least what happened at the moment of Helen's death. She apparently acquiesced to commit suicide, but as she died, her body was transfigured. This fragment is allegedly found in the papers of one Dr. Matheson, apparently one of the people whom accompanied Villiers to this, lynch mob style execution of Helen. I'm not exactly sure. He's maybe a witness, maybe Clark is there, we don't really know. His notes were apparently written in Latin and in a form of shorthand, but they were eventually deciphered years later. And this is what the fragment says, quote, "Though horror and revolting nausea rose up within me, and an odor of corruption choked my breath, I remained firm. I was then privileged or accursed, I dare not say which, to see that which was on the bed, lying there black like ink, transformed before my eyes. The skin, and the flesh, and the muscles, and the bones, and the firm structure of the human body that I had thought to be unchangeable and permanent as adamant, began to melt and dissolve. I know that the body may be separated into its elements by external agencies, but I should have refused to believe what I saw. For here there was some internal force, of which I knew nothing, that caused dissolution and change. Here too was all the work by which man has been made, repeated before my eyes. I saw the form waver from sex to sex, dividing itself from itself, and then again reunited. Then I saw the body descend to the beasts, whence it ascended, and that which was on the heights go down to the depths, even to the abyss of all being. The principle of life which makes organism always remained, while the outward form changed. The light within the room had turned to blackness, not the darkness of night, in which objects are seen dimly, for I could see clearly and without difficulty, but it was the negation of light. Objects were presented to my eyes, if I may say so, without any medium, in such a manner that if there had been a prism in the room, I should have seen no colors represented in it. I watched, and at last I saw nothing but a substance as jelly. Then the latter was ascended again. Here the manuscript is illegible. For one instance I saw a form, shaped in dimness before me, which I will not further describe. But the symbol of this form may be seen in ancient sculptures and in paintings which survived beneath the lava, too foul to be spoken of, as a horrible and unspeakable shape, neither man nor beast, was changed into human form. There finally came death. I who saw all this, not without great horror and loathing of soul, here write my name, declaring all that I have set on this paper to be true." End quote. So, my only comment here, aside from the fact that this is an incredible scene, Remember the story of Christ's transfiguration. His body transforms into a form of pure light, a miracle witnessed by some of his followers near the end of his life. It's a much debated scene in the New Testament in terms of interpretations of its meaning. In this case, Helen, potentially an incarnation of Pan, also transfigures, not into light, but into darkness. And we might say into chaos, and into sort of, he calls it like the principle of life that creates organisms was always there, but sort of cycling through all the different forms, ascending and descending. Her form turns from male to female and back again. It splits and reabsorbs itself, turns to jelly, turns into unspeakable and horrible beasts. So she is formlessness, or all forms, incarnated into flesh. The iconoclasm incarnate, the dissolution of boundaries between forms of life, somehow made incarnate. And it's like this transfiguration reveals the true nature of what incarnated into Helen, just as perhaps the transfiguration of light in the story of Christ reveals him to be the true son of a God of light and life. But again, we only get this retelling in fragments which we learn had to be retranslated from shorthand Latin from a character that we've never met, and it's all from his perspective. So again, there's that unreliability that sort of cast doubt on, are we really seeing the true form of the God? The final fragment in the series is a letter from Dr. Raymond to Clark. Quote, "You remember that still summer night so many years ago, when I talked to you of the world beyond the shadows and of the god Pan. You remember Mary. She was the mother of Helen Vaughn, who was born 9 months after that night. Mary never recovered her reason. She lay as you saw her all the while upon her bed, and a few days after the child was born she died. I fancy that just at the last she knew me. I was standing by the bed, and the old look came into her eyes for a second, and then she shuddered and groaned and died. It was an ill work I did that night when you were present. I broke open the door of the house of life, without knowing or caring what might pass forth or enter in. I recollect your telling me at the time, sharply enough, and rightly too in one sense, that I had ruined the reason of a human being by a foolish experiment, based on an absurd theory. You did well to blame me, but my theory was not all absurdity. What I said Mary would see, she saw. But I forgot that no human eyes can look on such a sight with impunity. And I forgot, as I have just said, that when the house of life is thus thrown open, there may enter in that for which we have no name, and human flesh may become the veil of a horror one dare not express. I played with energies which I did not understand. You have seen the ending of it." End quote. And so Raymond reveals that he was the adoptive father. He was the one who sent Helen to live at the Welsh farmhouse. He provided her generous stipend, and he says that he knew, from the time she was as young as 5 years old, he knew what Helen was. He says he even saw her with her playmate once or twice, and you can guess who that was, the so-called man in the woods. And he reveals that it wasn't for Helen's well-being that he sent her away, but because her presence was a constant incarnate horror that reminded him of the horrible experiment that they had done, and he could no longer bear being around her. The story thus ends, quote, "You know now what frightened the boy in the wood. The rest of the strange story, and all else that you tell me, as discovered by your friend, I have contrived to learn from time to time, almost to the last chapter. And now, Helen is with her companions." The end. Note: Helen Vaughn was born on August 5th, 1865, at the Red House, Breconshire, and died on July 25th, 1888, in her house in a street off Piccadilly, called Ashley Street, in the story. End quote. So, we end on that note. You did well to blame me for engaging in this foolish experiment. But not because the experiment was foolish. You did well to blame me because my theory was not an absurdity, because we actually did see beyond the veil. We actually did throw open the doors of the house of life. And the terrible reality is that by opening that door, you're not just peering into the abyss is peering back into you. But the ending is a recapitulation of that theme, we elaborated upon at the beginning, the horror of truth. Experiment and inquiry represented not as the route of unqualified progress, but as something dangerous. And not for the reason that the scientific worldview will somehow miss out on the truth of religion. We might say that that's the more common warning about excessive scientism these days, about pursuing the mechanistic worldview to its ultimate conclusions, that you'll disenchant or you'll desacralize the world. Remember, though, Machen studied alchemy, and the alchemists didn't set up this dichotomy between science and religion, between material and spiritual. The point is that science actually uncovers a religious truth in this story. That's one way to look at it. We discover through science that the ancients were correct when they said that to look beyond the world of the senses was to meet the great god Pan, to encounter the dark and secret forces at the heart of the world. So science doesn't desacralize the world in this story. Science is what plunges the world into a confusing vortex of supernatural occurrences. Science in this story doesn't bring certainty. And while the chronological narrative of events is relatively clear by the end of the story, most of the major questions remain unanswered. Many of the key moments are never described, only referenced or alluded to. What happened to Rachel? What did Helen do to Herbert exactly? Why did somebody die on their property? What happened to Myrick? How did Villiers capture Helen? And these moments are left to the imagination, and that's the thing that Machen excels at. He sets an atmosphere and keeps the horror looming in the background, but he never shows the monster. And in spite of all the morbid details in the story, the characters who express this unspeakable feeling of horror, part of the enduring allure of the tale is the way it mingles morbidity with beauty. That is Helen's character, after all. As Austen says at one point, quote, "Everyone who saw her said she was at once the most beautiful woman and the most repulsive they had ever set eyes on. I have spoken to a man who saw her, and I assure you he positively shuddered as he tried to describe the woman, but he couldn't tell why." End quote. And what does that remind of? Perhaps Rilke's words, quote, "For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, which we are still just able to endure, and we are so awed because it serenely disdains to annihilate us." End quote. And so, the story, The Great God Pan, is at a glance a story about the terror of an encounter with the pagan world. And yet the way Machen lovingly describes the beauty of nature, or the mystique of a dark, misty night on a London street, one cannot help but feel wistful when reading it. You can't help but understand how somebody could be seduced by the pagan nature gods, just as Machen himself was seduced in his youth at the ruins of Caerwent, and just as many men are seduced by Helen over the course of the story. That's perhaps its most subversive element, perhaps even intuited by its critics, that though the ones who called it a debauched story, because in spite of the fact that the text of the story tells us that what happens to the characters is a terrible evil fate, in spite of the fact that we know the fate of those who chanced to meet the great god Pan, the way the world of the great god Pan is described still seems so alluring. In spite of its fatality, we still want to experience it. We still want to know. That's all for this week, everyone. There's another episode coming out this week on the day of Halloween, so stay tuned for that. Samhain is fast approaching, and the veil between the worlds is weakening, so keep your eyes peeled. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.